Well, good morning, officially. I'm Pam Bruns. I'm the founder and director of the Human Rights Watch Student Task Force, and I'm with my colleague, my dear colleague, Kristen Gazarians, who won't be speaking that much today, but should be. She's trying to manage all the tech for this. So Kristen, maybe you can just say hi so everybody can see where you are on here.
Good morning, everyone. Looking forward to experiencing this event with you.
I just want to give you a couple introductions and explain why we're here today. Last spring, Daryl and Story invited us to come to Tree Academy to meet with you and share our work training high school students in human rights advocacy. But the pandemic intervened. So here we are much later and virtually, and the need for human rights advocacy has only become more essential and more urgent. Daryl and Story asked us to make two presentations during your orientation. The first one is today, and we want you to meet a great friend of ours, Nancy Flowers, for an introduction to human rights education. She'll be joined by an alumna of the Student Task Force, Linda Gordon, who is a former student leader, to give her perspective on human rights education. And then at the conclusion of both of those presentations, we'll ask for your questions. Tomorrow, we'll return and share our mission and experiences with the Student Task Force, and some current student leaders will tell you about their training and advocacy for human rights, and they'll also explain how STF functions. But before I give the virtual stage to Nancy, I want to read you a note I keep on my desk. It's a quote from someone very special to me and to the Human Rights Watch Student Task Force. We were on the phone one day several years ago when Sid Sheinberg very passionately said to me, "We have a moral obligation to our children to give them the knowledge of their human rights," a moral obligation. As you may know, Sid is Story's grandfather, and we miss him so much, but we can still hear him urging us on. And really in these days, I can't think of anything more important than to make sure that we all, but especially students, know their human rights. So to start us on our way, I'm going to ask Nancy Flowers, who is a writer, editor, and consultant in human rights. She's advised governments and non-governmental agencies, UN agencies, and the Student Task Force to please introduce us to human rights education. Nancy.
Thank you. I'm really frustrated because my first job in this world was as a teacher like you. I taught high school English for 25 years before I entered the human rights field. And as a classroom teacher, I know the give and take in the classroom, talking back and forth, which is not possible today, is where it all really is. And so I've tried to make some accommodations given that we're all in different places. So I'm going to talk first about what are human rights and what is human rights education second. And during this time, occasionally I'm going to ask you to jot down some thoughts. If we were in the classroom, we would share them and discuss them. But so have a pencil and paper ready. And at the end, have this, I think most of you got this little booklet of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Do have that nearby because we're going to conclude with actually reading it. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, to go on to gallery view because I'm going to ask some questions and I want us all to see how each other answers those questions. So would you now switch to gallery view? I will also. Okay. Did you all have, Pam, I see you rather than gallery view. Anyway.
So you're still in speaker view then?
No, I'm in gallery view. Okay, there you go. Okay, folks, I'm going to ask, just raise your hand, and when you answer, put your hand up so we can see it in the camera. First question. When you were in high school, how many of you actually learned about human rights in high school? Oh, some hands. I'm delighted. Things are getting better. For those of you who didn't do it in high school, how many of you got it in college? A few. How about post-college, graduate school, or anything else? Some of you, that's great. Now let me ask another question. How many of you learned about the US Constitution and Bill of Rights in high school? Everybody, mostly. And I'm willing to guess that if you didn't, you probably didn't go to high school in the United States, because you cannot graduate from any high school in the United States without something to do with the US Constitution and Bill of Rights. It's just mostly state law. I'm not going to ask you to write out the answer to this question, but I want you to reflect for just a moment, because we'll come back to this. Why do you think that the US doesn't teach human rights as a matter of course? In Europe and many other countries, human rights is just part of the curriculum, something that everybody learns. That's not the case in this country. In fact, in 1998, we did a survey to see what was the level of knowledge about human rights in this country. And it turned out that 94.6 people in the United States could not identify the most basic document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So now I'm going to ask you to go back to speaker view. And Kristen, if you would start the slide, the PowerPoint, with just the first one, please. This first one just says, what is human rights education? I'm guessing that some of you may have experienced fields of education that are closely related. If you haven't had human rights education itself, it could be conflict resolution or conflict management, peace education, social justice education, anti-racist and diversity training, global education. These are very closely related fields. There's one important difference, however, and that is that human rights education has an actual grounding in internationally accepted norms and standards. That is the UN Human Rights Framework. And assuming that many of you may be new to this material, that's what we're going to start with, is a kind of Human Rights 101. May I have the second slide, please? Before we do, however, I'm going to ask you to reflect. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but before we go into it, I want you to just jot down 3, 4, 5 rights that you would recognize as human rights. Could you do that now? We'll come back to this later, but just jot down what you think would be 3 or 4 or 5 human rights. On your screen, you see Universal Declaration of Human Rights, December the 10th, 1948. If your students don't learn anything about human rights, this is the place to start and finish. This is the foundation document. And let's look at it a little more closely. If we were in a classroom, I'd ask you, what's the significance of 1948? I'll have to say that it's pretty obvious. It's the end of World War II, 1945. It's also the year after the founding of the UN in 1947. December the 10th is the day that this document was adopted by the General Assembly, and it's now International Human Rights Day, a day which might be a good day to celebrate in your school. Let's look at the title of this too. It's called Universal Declaration. It could have been called International Declaration, but it's universal, acknowledging that many people on the globe don't have a nation. Universal implies it applies to all human beings, regardless of their citizenship status, of their adherence to one country or another. The second word is also important. Now the next slide, please. It's a declaration. Oh, sorry, there's the reflection. Let's go on to the next one then. A declaration is the weakest form of international law. It's really hardly law at all. It's more like a statement of principles. And most important, it's not legally binding. When the UN was founded in 1947, one of the first things it did was set up a committee to draft this Universal Declaration. In fact, you may know it was headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was not a lawyer, had never been to college, but had one great quality, which we'd all like to have, that she could get people to work together. And it was partly through her own efforts that in 1948, it was possible for the whole UN to unanimously adopt this declaration. However, it was not legally binding. So the next step was to try to take these principles and turn them into a convention, a legally binding agreement. Another word that we use the same way is a treaty or a covenant. Next slide, please. I think you have to click on it. So we have 1948, the Universal Declaration. Yeah. They couldn't get one document. You'll look and see here that there, instead of one document to embody human rights in a legally binding way, it took almost 20 years and they couldn't come up with one. They had to come up with two. What happened in those intervening years, we would discuss this if we were together. I'll just say it's the Cold War. And there was a definite ideological difference between the communist East Bloc, the capitalist West Bloc, about what rights were important. And we ended up with two documents, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. The countries of the West all immediately raced to adopt the Civil and Political Rights document. The East Bloc countries likewise took the economic, social, and cultural rights to heart. But there was almost like a schizophrenic divide in what people thought human rights were. Notice the word covenant. These are the only two documents in international law called covenants, and they're intentionally meant to allude to something almost sacred. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, a covenant is an agreement between the divine and the human. Only these two. But this, if you'll notice that 20 years went by, they just couldn't do it. Next slide, please. To make sure we're clear about this, civil and political rights are the rights that are most familiar to Americans. They are the ones mostly in our Constitution. We call them negative rights, and generally they're rights that protect the individual from the state, such as freedom of expression, religion, assembly. Economic, social, and cultural rights are more what we call positive rights. Rather than protecting the individual from the state, these place obligations on the state to provide for the citizen. For example, the right to education, shelter, an adequate standard of living. Incidentally, it comes to many Americans' surprise that the right to education is not in our Constitution. So you can see where this divide occurs. May I have the next slide, please? Go back and look at your own list of rights. And I wonder, did you include any social economic rights? If you did, that is to say, education, healthcare, shelter. If you did, you're very unusual. Most Americans, when asked to do this, immediately go to what are their constitutional rights, because we learn those, we know those, we live those. They will also often put the right to bear arms and not to quarter troops to show you how well they were listening in their junior year. Next slide, please. However, because there was this divide, it did not prevent the United Nations from going ahead and evolving a framework. This list of documents is really the main human rights documents, but they're altogether around 20. They fall into two categories. The first category is conventions against inhuman acts. You'll see here a convention against torture, a convention against racial discrimination. There's a convention against slavery. The other category are conventions that offer protection of the rights of what we call vulnerable populations. You'll see here the rights of the child, women's rights, the rights of people with disabilities. So in general, the UN framework has those two kinds of conventions. However, almost all of them contain both civil and political and social economic rights. You'll see that some of these have a star by them. Those are the ones that the United States has ratified. In particular, I want to point out that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been the most ratified of all UN conventions. In fact, only one country in the world has not ratified it, and that's the United States. We could go on for the whole rest of the morning talking about why is it that the United States hasn't ratified the rights of the child, or indeed most of the other conventions. But I'm going to, next slide, please. I'm going to ask you to be thinking about why. Why, in your own personal opinion, is it that the US doesn't ratify these documents, or ratifies very few? Ratification is a serious undertaking. If you ratify a convention, it means it becomes the law of the land in that country. And the country undertakes to do these things: to respect the law, to protect the law, to fulfill the law, and promote the law. The latter is where human rights education comes in. It's a serious thing, and a government can be called to account if they haven't done just that. Incidentally, under fulfill, the state must work towards progressive realization of the right. Not all states have the same ability to do that. Let's just say that the health care that you might get in Mali or in Bangladesh is not as good as the health care you might get in Egypt or South Africa, which is probably not as good as that in Germany. But the state does the best it can to the best of its ability. So there are serious reasons to not ratify. Next slide, please. But just take a second now, in your own opinion, why do you think that the US has not ratified most human rights treaties? There are many reasons, but this is something, again, if we were together, we would be able to discuss. There are lots of opinions about it. And this, your answer to this question may also relate to the question of why you think you didn't get human rights education in school if you didn't. And I apologize for my clock. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's donging the half hour. Next slide, please. This schizophrenia between civil and political rights, social, economic, social, and cultural rights actually got healed. In 1966, the division was radical. The UN held a UN conference on human rights in Vienna in 1993, and the consensus was it's just got to stop. You can't separate human rights. And in the Vienna Declaration was an important statement. Human rights are universal, that is, they apply to everybody regardless. They are indivisible. You can't pick the ones you like and reject the ones you don't like. And they are interdependent and interrelated. You might have the right to vote, but if you don't have an education, if you don't have the right to food or shelter, you're not going to be able to vote or vote wisely. Each right depends on other rights. It's a package. And since 1993, I'm happy to say almost all, I think only 4 countries in the world have now ratified both covenants, both civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. Again, the United States is one of those 4 that has not done that ratification. And again, if we had time and togetherness, we would discuss why. Next slide, please. So one of the main things I want you to come away with about human rights is it's evolving. For example, in 1948, in the Universal Declaration, there's not a mention, for example, of the environment, because in 1948, nobody was thinking about it. And one of the most important things that has changed about the human rights world is that more and more there is citizen participation. Civil society has a definite role. A lot of it's advocacy, just the kind of thing that Student Task Force is doing. One advocacy focus is to recognize new social issues in human rights terms. Nobody really thought earlier about environmental rights as human rights. also collective rights, which connects with environmental rights. Some rights affect the individual, but some affect the whole community. I think this virus has taught us that without any explanation. We're all together in this. Other areas in which people are pressing for the UN to recognize rights: LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights. And I will just say the Environmental Rights Declaration is already in the works. So drafting new documents is one great effort for civil society. Another is advocating that once you have the document, that it's being implemented. The UN has also realized that they can't just let it be the work of lawyers and diplomats to evolve these. I'll give you a personal example from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. I worked a long time with this. Partly was educating people with disabilities about their rights. This is before there was a convention. But they did invite people with disabilities to come to Geneva, to New York, and advocate, lobby for what they needed. And what they needed was from their perspective, not what you or I might think a person with disability needs. Giving them the language and the skills to go into the corridors and lobby. And I will say I was privileged to be at the UN on the day that this convention was adopted. You've never seen so many wheelchairs, so many guide dogs and personal assistant dogs. It was wonderful to see people with disabilities claiming the UN from themselves. The similar participation was done in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And most recently, there's now a declaration on human rights education and training. Let's turn now to the next slide. This is, let me go back one step. The UN paid pretty much no attention at all to human rights education for at least the first 20 years. What happened was citizens themselves began to use human rights education to make social change. It started particularly in Latin America during that period of military dictatorships. People went into the cities, into the slums, into the country, and told people about their rights. And they succeeded. It was a very important movement in Latin America, which has taught the rest of the world. The Philippines learned from Latin America in the overthrow of the Marcos regime with what they call the People's Revolution. South Africa followed suit. Another group that really took up human rights education and showed what it could do was the women's movements. It was women's rights are human rights. As a result, in the 90s, the UN got serious about human rights education. They declared a decade. There's now an ongoing world program. And many organizations that were not human rights organizations like Amnesty, for which I've worked a lot, or with Human Rights Watch, the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts now have human rights badges. The American Bar Association has a human rights education division. The Sierra Club has taken up human rights, looking at environmental rights, not as constitutional rights, but as human rights. So there's a real movement for human rights education. Your own student task force now 20 years ago took it up as something that it was very important to be doing for Human Rights Watch. And I've been part, as has Pam Bruns and Kristen, of a new network for teachers interested in human rights education, Human Rights Educators USA. So next slide, please. This is what the UN has said human rights education should be: about human rights, through human rights or in human rights, and for human rights. Now, about human rights is the content. It's what you teach. And that's maybe more challenging to some of you because, as many of you haven't had a background in this, don't worry about it. Next slide, please. About human rights is the subject matter. If you don't teach anything but the Universal Declaration and the principles that inform it, that's enough. That's really enough. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is probably the second most important, especially for us as educators who care about kids. Kids need to know about their rights too. Even though the United States hasn't ratified it, it is international law, and very important to know about. These other factors are important too. I'm not going to read you the slide for the sake of time, but don't worry about the subject matter. The Universal Declaration will take you all the way. Next slide, please. This next one is the most challenging, perhaps, and that is human rights education in human rights. That is to say, in an environment that also reflects human rights. This is about the way you teach. As we all know, part of what you teach is how you teach it. The classroom environment, the values and culture of the school community are absolutely essential here. Two things to say about this besides what's on the screen. Many of us who have worked for human rights organizations know that the typical motive is to point out abuses and to mobilize people against human rights abuses. One of the things about human rights education doesn't neglect abuses, but to look at human rights as a positive, as a way to live together, as a set of goals and values and norms for the best of us. And finally, it's very important to talk about human rights in the classroom, in the school community, as also a responsibility. A right, if you have the right to express yourself, others should have the right to express themselves. And by school community, I don't just mean the building. It includes the parents. It includes everyone who connects with the school, whether they're students, faculty, staff, administrators, but also the wider community. The school is never isolated. So in human rights may be perhaps the greatest challenge for all of us. It's all ongoing. And finally, the last slide here is for human rights. For human rights involves action. And there are two sides to this. Educating people for human rights has an internal and an external. The internal is really about personal change, openness to reflecting on your own situation, and empathy, compassion, solidarity with those who have suffered violations. And then also external, taking action in the world. It might be action in the classroom. It might be action in the real world. But the skills involved are very important. Analysis, critical thinking, independent thinking to form individual responses. We certainly think there are situations where human rights education could look too much like an indoctrination. It's very important that students, all of us, be given the freedom to form our own opinions. And I use the term informed activism. Whatever action is taken, it's taken with an awareness of human rights and background knowledge. So I'm going to just now leave this slide up and say, what is it? Why should you consider teaching human rights altogether? I'm going to speak from my own personal opinion, but for me, we want to give our students, we want for ourselves the best there is, the best we know of. For me, human rights represents a value system that reflects the best standards of collective human wisdom. It's not tied to any particular ideology, any faith, any culture. It is something that we hope, we pray can be part of a world culture. It does sometimes create some cognitive dissonance for students if some of these values conflict or don't quite fit with what they've learned at home or what their faith base is. I would say to you that especially for high school students, that kind of dissonance can be wonderful learning. To have to look at the fact that there are 2 or 3 or maybe more ways to look at an issue. Human rights is not the only way. Also to stress always that it's still an evolving system. It's not delivered as divine word, but it is collective wisdom And it's changing all the time, not changing to narrow, but changing to broaden. I've given you some examples about how, well, for example, in the Universal Declaration, women are only mentioned as mothers, that motherhood deserves special protection. But the idea that women had human rights is evolving. So it's an evolving system. I also think that teaching human rights creates concerned and involves citizens. Citizens who are engaged but have the principles to stand, their engagement stands for something. In a very secular world, human rights does not take the place of a faith, but for many people it does give them a set of values for which to make decisions about their lives in the way that they stand in the world. And for the same reason, I think for many students especially, it gives them the confidence that they can stand for something. For me, that something is human rights. I want to leave you with a final reflection, the next and last slide. We're not going to write about this, but I hope you'll have time to think and talk about it. How can you educate about, in, and for human rights at Tree Academy? What do you think your students need to know? How will you make it relevant to their lives? And how can you fit it into your classroom or your area of responsibility? I want to thank you for your attention. I get very carried away talking about this. Forgive me, I would be probably more carried away if you were here in person and I could see your faces. I want to pass now to Linda Gordon. We talked about informed activism. She is someone who lives the kind of engaged citizenship that I think human rights education can produce. Linda?
Wow, thank you so much. I have to say, I've been almost flooded with memories listening to this presentation and thinking back to when I first heard it in high school and just what a difference it's made in my life, and applying this framework to how I live, how I learn, how I interact in society. It's been a real pleasure to hear you and think about how your words have bounced around in my head all these years. I was a part of the Human Rights Watch Student Task Force at Santa Monica High School and graduated in 2014. So it's been a few years since I was there. But I think that the Student Task Force, which I believe is being started at Tree Academy, which I'm so excited about, and you'll hear from more recent students tomorrow. But that was really the space where I received the majority of my human rights education in high school, and working on different human rights advocacy campaigns, beginning in my freshman year when I was involved. Over the course of the 4 years, I think you could see a real evolution in me and my cohort and how we were thinking about human rights, first in the context of this club as something that we learned, and that was kind of contained within that space. It was something that we did not necessarily immediately connect beyond that. And then as we put these principles and values into practice and spent more time familiarizing ourselves with them and the history, which just provides such valuable lessons, and thinking about the split that was eventually overcome. But I think in thinking about the education that I've received in the United States, in the context of civil rights and this idea of negative rights and what is owed but not given, so much of that feels very relevant to understanding what has gotten us here today, and what is or isn't taught. And so in my senior year of high school, senior or junior year, the right to education was the focus of the Student Task Force campaign that we were working on. And we spent a lot of time engaging with each other and discussing what this right is. We were not all familiar with right to education as a human right at the beginning of the campaign, and that was an education in and of itself. And over time, as we became involved and we were really passionate about sharing this message and this issue, we also were increasingly frustrated at the lack of human rights education and what we saw as a divide between those who were in this club and who were not in the education that was being received. And it was really in that frustration that the idea for this human rights education workshop was born. And so at Santa Monica High School, a group of students, myself included, created this human rights education workshop for teachers as part of a professional development day called Sam High University. And we were the only student group presenting. And we met and worked with 12 teachers, providing techniques, lesson plans, and materials for integrating more knowledge of human rights into their existing courses. And we really saw this workshop as a catalyst for increased student and teacher collaboration and for informing teachers about ways to integrate human rights into their classes when at the time we were often met with some resistance, reference to standards, reference to other lesson plans, reference to not wanting to be political. And we found so much meaning and value in this work and applying it across all of our courses that we really believe that other students deserve to have this exposure, to have this experience as well. It should not be just restricted to this club. And we really wanted to share that passion and excitement with the teachers to show how their classes took on new meaning and new value when human rights was applied in the classroom. And this was relevant in English and history and humanities courses, but in some ways even more so in math and sciences and other contexts where human rights was not maybe naturally thought of. And there was a quote that we came across when we were developing the workshop and really in the early days of working on the Right to Education campaign, which has really stuck with me for many years, and I'd like to share it now. And this was a quote that we learned, I think it was first in the context of a Facing History curriculum from a teacher who was a concentration camp survivor and had been gone through the Holocaust and was a school principal as well. And they said, "I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers. Children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses. Women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human." That quote kind of there was a quiet in the classroom when we first read it out loud. And it was really a breakthrough moment with the teachers too, when we began to really come together and understand the importance of human rights as a foundation, as a framework across our courses, across in thinking about the world and thinking about we engage far beyond the classroom. And going on to college, I majored in history and human rights, and I now work at a legal nonprofit that provides education and training for lawyers who want to become more involved in public interest and social justice law. And those words still bounce around my head in thinking about finding the human rights perspective on what I'm doing, and especially now, and thinking about what is going on in the world and thinking about the fact we're all meeting virtually. This is not normal. And for kids struggling to understand why they need to log in and learn math or science, I think that human rights is a framework that can show the relevance of that and make more educated citizens beyond just the class curriculum, which frankly they might not remember, given the kind of turmoil that we're experiencing, but they will remember if they read a text in their English class by James Baldwin or Audre Lorde, the specific choices that you make through which you convey the knowledge. I remember so distinctly when the content that I learned not only helped me engage critically, but also made me feel differently. And I think that is what you as teachers can impart in such powerful and meaningful ways. And I'm so grateful for the human rights education I received and continue to receive. And I think that exploring the website of Tree Academy, I have to say it's really inspiring to see what you're trying to do here. And when I think back about the struggles that we engaged in high school to incorporate human rights education into the classroom, I already see how you're miles ahead in so many ways, and really actively working to do what we wanted so badly, and continue to advocate for. And that is inspiring and commendable. But I know it's really hard work. And so I think that as a student who benefited and is so grateful for the human rights education I received, I want to impart that it's worth it. And your students will remember you as the teacher who helped change their life and change the way they think about the world for incorporating this into the way you teach. So I think that I'm gonna stop there for now. I know I want to leave time for questions, and I think that you know, as part of the workshop, we spent a lot of time developing lessons actually with teachers. For science classes, for example, we talked about incorporating the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks being the woman whose cells were taken from her without her knowledge in the 1950s, that were the HeLa cells that form then the basis for medical advances like the polio vaccine and in vitro fertilization, and all of these incredible advances used with her cells completely without her knowledge. And we talked about using that in science courses to think about the context of medical advances and research, and thinking about what has brought the knowledge to the classroom and all the ethical and often racist in the United States implications of that. And being aware of that history, and other examples as well. But I think for now, I'd really just love to hear from you and any questions you might have.
For anybody who's interested in asking a question of Nancy or Linda, if you can just send your name in the chat and we'll have them call on you, that would be great.
May I suggest we go ahead and do the reading and let people be thinking about their questions?
We do
and
have one person who wants to make a question
Okay.
or make a
Matt?
comment.
Yeah, it wasn't really so much a question as just a comment. As I looked up that quote that you said from the Holocaust survivor, and that's really, really good. And I think that's worth rereading again and filing away somewhere. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Thank you. Ray, do you have a comment or question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for presenting. I had a question in terms of just within what's happening in America these days in the climate with social justice, race relations, police brutality, how you all kind of see or draw parallels to the overall work within human rights on a maybe global perspective, in comparison to the experiences and the tensions and the uprisings and the protests that are going on now?
I'll begin the response in this way. Because there is some real resistance to social economic rights or even to human rights in the United States. You know, there are many people who'd like to see the United States withdraw from the UN altogether. So we are, politicians in particular, but people in general are very careful about using the word human rights. For example, when the Affordable Health Care Act was in progress. You heard a lot of people speaking for it, but you heard almost no one say, incidentally, healthcare is a human right. You hear nowadays politicians saying, oh, socialist, leftist. They don't say communistic or very seldom anymore. So that the press and leaders are often very reluctant to take a local issue and call it a human rights violation. There is that whole resistance. So yes, there are human rights violations going on, but generally our press puts them in terms of our own national law. I would say absolutely there are human rights violations, but it's the naming of it that's somehow not politic at the moment.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, which I completely agree, and I think in many ways for those very reasons, it's why naming it as human rights violations is even more important now, and particularly for students. I think that in high school, when we worked on advocacy campaigns, but also right to education in California and addressing human rights violations in California, it really was a powerful experience to label this as a human rights violation, to think of it in the context of not just civil rights in the United States, but that this is part of an international document which has been labeled as wrong, which has been labeled as something to be condemned. And I think thinking in particular about the violence and such political strife that has torn this country apart, for children to understand this as a human rights issue, to be trained early on in these very fundamental rights, and seeing them carried out in the United States is really powerful and really important.
And just to add one other thing, about 20 years ago, Amnesty International internationally did a campaign about human rights violations in the United States. And many people said, what? Human rights violations in the United States? They happen somewhere else, not here. Some of the issues were our juvenile justice system, certainly racial inequality, our prison system, and our death penalty system, which of course is terribly racially imbalanced. But people almost resisted this campaign, saying, we don't have human rights violations here. So there's a lot of, this is about semantics and language, but I certainly agree with Linda that one of the skills for human rights education is looking at an issue in human rights terms, seeing where are the issues here in human rights terms. That perspective is very helpful and important. It raises it from something local to something that's a violation of a global standard or norm. That's a good question. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Sign, did you have a question?
Hi, yeah, it's Signe. I'm curious, when you were receiving this education, was it primarily the advocacy that you were taking up local? Because I'm thinking about what we were asked to reflect upon about why the United States has not ratified a number of these or taken a position. And immediately what comes to mind is that typically our government is designed to protect corporations and not individuals. And if we adopted the rights of the child, then we would have to prevent chocolate companies from using children and slaves to, gather cocoa. We would have to take a broader political stance as a country on what we allow our corporations to do. And I wonder if that's a piece of that education, or if yours was much more focused on the state of California and those kinds of things.
So through the Student Task Force, we engaged on human rights campaigns that were national but also largely international campaigns, thinking about, and we often worked in conjunction with a Human Rights Watch campaign that was going on. And I know that this is going to be talked about tomorrow, so I won't share too much about it, but I think it's a really important piece of human rights education in the United States, because that one of the most frequent conversations that we had was just thinking about, why haven't we learned this? How have we been trained to think of this as something, human rights violations is something happening elsewhere, and not here? What is this American exceptionalism in the context of human rights? And how can we unpack that and unlearn that in many ways? And that often came back to, what are our government's interests? Who are they protecting? Are they protecting corporations? Are they protecting citizens? If they're not protecting citizens, then how does that play into this responsibility factor, which I think was something that really resonated with us, that as we were learning that we had a responsibility to share this information, to share this framework with others, to engage. And again, that's where some of that frustration started to bubble up. But I think it's really important to bring the context, the political background, the interests at play for why human rights aren't represented in the United States. And if you're teaching a course like history, for example, that's probably a lot easier to do. But I think that in other contexts too, and thinking about the pharmaceutical industry and thinking of in the context of healthcare as a right, definitely in big tech and computer science, there's a lot there to draw on. And so finding ways to connect the interests at play with the subject that you're teaching in the context of human rights is very powerful. I think we have a couple more questions. Juan was raising his hand, and then we'll go to Alex.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what are the efforts that are being made to create effective human rights courts that are going to be taking care of these issues? Because one thing that I can observe, well, I have a background in law, is that, you know, I might be in front of an injustice situation, of an illegal situation, but it's not up to me to declare that something is wrong, even though it could be obviously wrong for me. So it's not up to me to decide what is a violation of human rights, even though it might be very obvious. So I think at the end of the day, we might need a court, an effective court, more effective than the Strasbourg tribunal, something that could be implemented nationally, everywhere, maybe. So what are the efforts that are we making on this? Because yeah.
You know, I wish I could tell you what those efforts are, but if it's happening, I don't know about it. Linda?
Yeah, I think so. I actually I mentioned for a legal nonprofit now, and we are engaged in a few cases before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And there is actually a case, the first case against the United States is currently making its way through the commission and hoping to be referred to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. Of course, the United States government is doing everything that it can to stop this from happening. And there are constant threats of withdrawing from the UN, of withdrawing from the court. And just from the meetings that I've been a part of, I think that needing buy-in from governments to adhere to standards and to even be held accountable, be willing to go to court, or the time that it takes to compel a government to go to court when they are not a compliant participant, it seems like it's going to be many years before that type of justice is granted, and in some ways it might never be granted in an international law setting. But I think that it is incredibly important, and I think movements around litigation, movements around international law, I think the Declaration of Human Rights is a perfect example of not a legally binding document, but still so valuable from a legal perspective in understanding that. I think we have to get more creative because movements in international law have been slow and sometimes ineffective.
I think Alex had a question.
Thank you so much. I think this is more directed for Linda, just as a younger person. I do think that in LA it can be seen that we are like a more progressive city, and so that maybe the harm of these sorts of factors aren't as intense here. I'm sure you doing your work, you didn't have lines out the door of your peers trying to sign up and be a part of this work with you. I guess I'm curious, what have you found to be helpful or a good methods for organizing people that obviously we're going to be working with high schoolers and middle schoolers and helping them develop the consciousness and the desire to get closer to this, just to this work and these feelings and this understanding. I do think about a couple students who could be leaders in this space at our school, but trying to think about how to help them build community, and if you had any advice on what's worked well.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I first joined, so I think the fact that the Student Task Force was a club, a voluntary lunchtime club, speaks to, our numbers definitely fluctuated over the years. So some days there were just a couple people showing up to a club meeting, and we were texting and calling and trying to get people to come. And then there were other times, and I think that events were really a grounding force for this, when we were all working together on an educational event for our peers, that really compelled people to come together. And I think too, just that's where the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the history of human rights, which is so seeped in community, was incredibly powerful, to understand that we were joining a community of advocates that was far-reaching, that was extensive, and we really felt that connection to people who were human rights advocates in the United States, but also abroad. It really made us feel like we were a part of something bigger than ourselves, and that we could draw strength too from others across the country and across the world, and ask for advice. And we, through the connection with Human Rights Watch too, I didn't really understand human rights advocacy as a career, or social justice organizing, community organizing as a career when I first started high school. And just even seeing role models in that space, being exposed to examples of people who really built a life in community, organizing around these values and structuring their whole life around these values, was also really powerful and really helped. So definitely showing those examples. There's so many organizations in LA that are doing such incredible work, and so many people, and that's where having guest speakers come in, or showing film clips or other things like that. Those were always really motivating moments.
We have about 3 minutes left, and I'd like to conclude by, actually, we've been talking all morning about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's actually quite short, and we're going to read an abbreviated version together, just so you hear perhaps for the first time what's in it. And because normally we would read it all together in the classroom, but we'll just have 4 readers, and I'm going to start. So if you have your little booklet, in the front, there's an abbreviated version. That's what we're reading from. But the rest of the text is also not very long. The Universal Declaration has simple language. It's accessible to almost everybody. And just so you know, it holds the Guinness Book of Records award for the most translated human document. More than the Bible, more than the Quran, the Universal Declaration has been translated. And I'll say more about that at another time, because there's a group in LA that's recording strange and wonderful dialects of the Universal Declaration. So if you look at it while we read, I'm going to start, and Pam is going to read, and Story and Linda. So, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1, right to equality.
Article 2, freedom from discrimination.
Article 3, right to life, liberty, and personal security.
Article 4, freedom from slavery.
Article 5, freedom from torture and degrading treatment.
Article 6, right to recognition as a person before the law.
Article 7, right to equality before the law.
Article 8, right to remedy by competent tribunal.
Article 9, freedom from arbitrary arrest and exile.
Article 10, right to fair public hearing.
Article 11, right to be considered innocent until proven guilty.
Article 12, freedom from interference with privacy, family, home, and correspondence.
Article 13, right to free movement in and out of the country.
Article 14, right to asylum in other countries from persecution.
Article 15, right to nationality and the freedom to change nationality.
Article 16, right to marriage and family.
Article 17, right to own property.
Article 18, freedom of belief and religion.
Article 19, freedom of opinion and information.
Article 20, right of peaceful assembly and association.
Article 21, right to participate in government and in free elections.
Article 22, right to social security.
Article 23, right to desirable work and to join trade unions.
Article 24, right to rest and leisure.
Article 25, right to adequate living standard.
Article 26, right to education.
Article 27, right to participate in the cultural life of community.
Article 28, right to social order that articulates this document.
Article 29, community duties essential to free and full development.
And finally, Article 30, freedom from state or personal interference in the above rights.
Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. I wish you such a I always feel like telling teachers Happy New Year when it's this time of the year. So Happy New Year. I wish you a wonderful, wonderful new year at Tree Academy. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
Good luck, everyone. Good luck with the year.